Hey there, Squirrel Army. Today we're doing a simplistic or as simplistic guide to the stack and priority as what we can do. But just before we get any further into the video, if you're enjoying the content here, you can join the Squirrel Army by subscribing and turning on the notifications. It keeps the squirrels from eating your nuts. But with that, let's get back into the content. Alright, so we are discussing priority and the stack as simply as possible as what we can, because these rules are quite complicated when you start to get into them, and they are more complicated for some people than for other people in a sense as well, because some people grasp things much easier and quicker than other people grasp them. And I wanted to try to do this in the most simplistic way possible, and whatnot. And it does get really complicated, especially when you have four other players or three other players or whatever, you and three other players, so four players in total or more. If you're playing 5 players, 6 players, 7 players, 8 players. Now, sometimes the rules are a bit wonky with certain things, because sometimes people will just do things out of order, and sometimes that's kind of, okay in the casual format of Commander that we all play, because, hey, well, technically speaking, like, honestly, if, I'm player 1 and I've cast a spell, and my spell is on the stack, the player that's to my left has the immediate priority before any other player other than me. And that's only if I have an instant or something to respond to my own spell. So that's already really complicated in a sense, because player number 4, which is the player that's just before me, could just be like, well, you know what, I'm just going to counter that spell. But do they technically have priority? Technically, no, because the player, the first player to my left hasn't technically passed priority. But in Commander, a lot of times this happens where people are just like, well, I'm just going to counter, or I'm just going to kill it, or I'm just going to do this, or whatever, because they know what they're doing for the most part, and they're just going to do it. And sometimes people are a bit gun shy, sometimes a bit, or they want other people to be like, hey, solve the problem for me, thank you very much, type thing. And I even talked about that in how to use removal better, or whatever I call that video, and whatnot. But anyway, that is one of those things where that is a useful strategy to an extent, but technically speaking, what you're meant to do is be like, hey, player 1, or whatever, Johnny, whoever it is, do you pass priority on this? Yes, okay, cool. Alex, do you pass priority on this? Like, you don't actually have to go through this and be like, each person, hey, do you pass priority? Do you pass, like, type thing. But you'd be like, okay, so does anyone have any responses? And then you just like, hey, have response? No. Have response? No. Have response? Yes. Okay, cool. That's kind of like, but it doesn't really work that way for the most part, even if it's not technically correct. A lot of times, not technically correct things will happen in the game, and it's not, and I sort of talked about this in rules lawyering as well, where it's not that important to 100% stick to exactly what the rules kind of are. Like, some people get really uppity about, oh, well, Steven there hasn't passed priority yet, and whatnot. But if he had have had something, for the most part, or didn't want to use his removal, or didn't want to do anything, then he probably just is waiting for another time, or another space, or whatever, or trying to save, as many cards in hand, or he's trying to do something else. So it's obvious that he's not responding at this time, because he would have done so perhaps already. That is, of course, perhaps if he was not perhaps a little slow on the uptick of, like, whatnot, of, like, picking up what's going on and what's happening in the game and what the state of the game is. And, Devon over here is. He's like, oh no, I can't let Adam have this, Cradle of Behemoth or whatever it is, like, quick, counter it, because he's got a board full of squirrels or something, or whatever it is, like, again, but, like, it's one of those things. It's always very situational on what someone is doing and what someone has and why they would choose to respond and not respond, and how that actually affects, like, the priority order and whatnot. Because again, like, Cedric, or whoever is, player number 3, who might be like, oh, cool, thanks for that, whoever it was that was casting the spell. I've already forgotten who I used as an example. Devon, wasn't it? But anyway, thanks, Devon. That's a cool spell. You know what I'm going to do in response is I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to Swords to Plowshares, or whatever it is, your commander, or I'm going to counterspell your counterspell to do something else, or whatever it is, and things like that. So there's all kinds of little things like, oh, well, in response to that, I'm actually going to do this and do that. Because, like, they're like, sometimes you might be like, well, I don't know whether my spell's going to get countered type thing. You might be like, well, I just don't want my spell to be countered, so I'm just going to pass my turn to the next player and wait for them to tap out trying to counter somebody else's thing, and then be like, hey, you know what, I'm just going to cast my spell now after you've already cast your counter spell and used up most of your mana. Haha, now I'll get my spell out. So that's another little bit of strategy there, but again, I guess doesn't really, it essentially affect priority in that way too much. But again, it's one of those things that can get in the way of, well, actually, it's not your priority right now to do that, but in technical speaking, but in the speaking of, well, this is a casual format, okay, cool, you're going to do that, but actually before you did that, technically I wanted to do something and I have first priority. So before you technically do that, I'm going to do this type thing. So you can have those moments to be like, hey, hang on a second, because technically before you have priority to do anything, I have priority to do something because I'm player 1 after, Devon here is, casting his spell. So I get first priority, then, whoever's player 2 on my left gets priority after me. So if somebody jumps in there, you can be like, hey, can you just wait a second, because technically speaking, I have priority first, and hey, I wanted to do this. And that actually affects, like, how things play out or whatever, or I'm just going to sacrifice this thing, or I'm going to do this and do this or whatever. So there's all kinds of things. You never know what's in somebody's hands, so priority matters a lot when that sort of thing is going on. Like, one of the cards that I hate the most is Telepathy, which basically reveals everyone's hands. There's a few cards that are basically the same thing, but that's a well-known one. And when you see, hey, Devon over there is playing basically mono blue control, he has 50-something counterspells in his hand or whatever it is. So, well, you know what? Now that I know that, well, I'm not casting any spells for a while until he's out of mana or out of spells. So I'm just going to sit here and be like, well, I'm sad, whatever. And all I can really do is play lands and, see where I'm at, and then cast my instants when I can, or whatever. So, or try to cast my, sorcery speed stuff that hopefully will let me cast, some of my stuff, perhaps Vidal Canori or whatever, things like that, help me cast the things that I want to cast when I could, potentially cast them when, Devon there is out of mana or whatever, out of spells for the most part. So, again, it can be helpful, but it also, like, it is one of those nuisances that gets in the way of the game sometimes, and you would have played into things more and whatnot, and made more mistakes to a degree. But again, hey, that is what happens. Or someone might assess things a little bit differently based on seeing somebody else's hand, whatever. But I know this is getting off topic, but again, like, they might see, hey, there's Alex over there or whatever it is that has an Ulamog, Well, I don't really want them to have that Ulamog or whatever, or I'd rather them not have that Ulamog more than I'd rather Adam not, play his turn 2 ramp spell or whatever it is. Hey, I'm not really doing anything here, bro. I'm just casting my ramp spell, and he has Ulamog over there, so you really care that I'm doing that? Okay, cool. You know, it's one of those things like, that's more of a threat than what I'm doing over here. Just, casting my ramp spell, and maybe he's not casting it this turn or whatever, or maybe I'm casting my 5-drop or 6-drop or whatever it is. But again, like, do you want him to have that Ulamog or whatever in comparison to be having, Beast Whisperer or whatever it is that I've got? Okay, cool. Come on. It's one of those things. But again, anyway, and rules wise, like, there's a lot of little things that go on with, like, how the stack works, especially when there's multiple spells going on the stacks or multiple copies of spells going on the stack. It gets very complicated and things like that, and how you can be in priority and how these things sort of target things, especially with things like grape shot, gut shot, things like that, whatnot, and how these things work. Because if somebody essentially is, especially with gut shot and some of these other spells that also use the player's life or whatnot, or if somebody has Bolus's Citadel or whatnot, some of these other cards that are out there, and is actually casting Grape Shot off the top of their deck with Bolus's Citadel or things like this, in some ways to shuffle it back into the deck or whatnot, and cascading or whatnot, and it's basically one of the only spells that they basically sort of cascade into, or whatever, shuffle back to the top in some way and keep casting, or shuffle back into the deck, or especially when there's only one card left in the deck or whatever, and whatnot, so that they can basically keep casting it for one life. If they get down to, one life and the spell is on the stack, at that point, if you have anything, or perhaps if they're at 3 life, if you have Lightning Bolt, because this is probably a bit more likely, but still, you can, in response to, hey, I'm at 1 life, you're going to gut shot me or whatever it is, or, for the last points of life, even with Storm or whatever it is, on the stack, I'm going to Lightning Bolt you, and you can't really do anything because it's still on the stack, so you can't shuffle it in, blah, 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 and all of that. So at that point, they die. So it's like, oh, okay, cool. I survived, even with, 50, 60, whatever it was, Grape Shot triggers on the stack still, or whatever it was, that were probably going to kill me. But hey, at that point, it didn't matter because, hey, I killed the player first before they could actually resolve the rest of their triggers. And this is another one of those things where cast triggers are important as well. So if something's a cast trigger, it goes onto the stack anyway. If something's a triggered effect and it doesn't require a specific thing to resolve, in a sense, like the creature being on the battlefield still or whatever or whatnot, then that effect still goes off, essentially. So Cascade, like Hydroid Crisis is like one of the most like well-known ones of these, because a lot of people got confused with that. Actually, Beast Whisperer, I think, as well, as one that a lot of people forget that that's a cast trigger. And there's a few enchantments or enchantress cards that are cast trigger based, and people forget that they're cast trigger based. So that if somebody goes, oh well, Swords to Plowshares or kill your thing that's drawing your cards or whatever, and you're like, well, I still get a card from this spell because, well, it's a cast trigger. And people get that kind of wrong a lot, where they're like, well, the enchantment's no longer there, so you don't get the effect. Well, yes, I do, because the trigger's already on the stack and it's going to resolve no matter what, because, I don't need the artifact or enchantment to actually be there to fully resolve that trigger, because the trigger's already on the stack and it's going to resolve one way or the other, unless you've got a way to negate the triggered effect. essentially. So that's a bit different, and that's very confusing as well for some people. Another piece of priority is like passing of phases or passing of like priority on somebody's turn. Like if I play, let's say, my commander onto my board state, if somebody says in response, you have to be very clear about what you're being in response to. If you say in response to that, I'm saying, well, is it on the stack? And if they say no, then at that point, so you say, well, it's resolved now. And they say yes. And I say, well, you can't do anything yet. And they're like, what do you mean? That is that you can't do anything basically until I have passed priority on my turn. So I have changed phases, i.e., I've gone to combat, or I've gone to my second main phase, or whatever it is, or I've cast another spell, or I've taken another game action, essentially, that you can respond to. You can't just say in response to that, because if you're saying in response to that, you're essentially saying what's on the stack. So if you're saying, well, in response to that, I'm going to lightning bolt it. Well, you actually can't, because again, it hasn't fully resolved in that case. And in that, like, this is one of those technical rules that, like, everyone knows what they mean by doing this, but hey, technically speaking, this is not the way it technically works. But we're not really getting into these are the technical rules, because that gets way too complicated. Again, it gets very, very complicated. But again, like, you can't just do something, technically speaking, to somebody's things without them actually doing something that you can actually respond to. If I play my commander and my commander is the Gruul Omnath, Angry Omnath, and then I play a land and trigger, I'm going to get a 5/5, then you can respond to the triggered effect that's getting me a 5/5. I'm still going to get that 5/5, and my commander's going to die. So I'm going to get that trigger of whenever elemental dies, I can do 3 damage to something. So, unless you're exiling it with swords or whatever. So, again, that's where those little things come into play, where people are like, well, I just want to kill your commander. Well, I'm still going to do this and get this effect, because technically speaking, that's how the rules work. You know, you can't just respond to me not doing anything or whatever. You've got to wait till I'm doing something, or I'm changing phases, or I've done something, or there's a trigger on the stack that you can respond to. But even then, once the trigger is on the stack, you can't really get rid of it unless you negate the triggered effect. So again, that's where, like, there's many, many other rules, and I don't want to go through every single one of them. But there's a lot of those effects, and again, like, there's a lot of complicated things with layering and things like that and whatnot. I'm not going to go into all of that either. And again, especially when, like, whose priority and things like that, and the way things resolve, like cards like Living Death work, and things like that, because it basically kills all creatures that are on the battlefield and brings all the creatures that were in graveyards before everything died onto the battlefield. So then people will have all these ETB triggers and be like, well, you know what, I'm going to have my creature fight your creature and blah, 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 and this and that. Technically, you can't do that because, well, you can't essentially see the effect and things like that. You can't target things that are coming onto the battlefield that way, because everything's coming onto the battlefield at the same time, in a sense, so you can't fight anything like that and do things like that. So it gets really complicated with certain things and things like that. So, like, if somebody's artifact or enchantment is out, like, and I've Living Death, or somebody's Living Death back Rexage or whatever, you can blow up that artifact or enchantment because it was already on the field before, so it is a legal target. But when certain things aren't legal targets, it's like, oh, okay, well, I can't target that and I can't target that because these are coming onto the field essentially at the same time, so they don't resolve until I've already kind of picked my targets, so I have to pick other targets than the targets that are coming onto the field, essentially. So there's all these crazy rules that are in this format, and that's one of those things. Like, a lot of these effects weren't meant to sort of be utilized together sometimes, and things like that. So they sort of work in a very weird way together sometimes. So again, it's a very complicated format, but I do hope that this has been a decent and mostly simple-ish guide to priority and the stack. I didn't cover everything as I sort of said, but I do hope that it does help some people and is useful, because again, it's a very complicated format. And hey, again, that's one of those things. This is a quite casual format, and if you get something wrong, it's one of those things where I don't think it should be a big deal. It never should be a big deal that you get something slightly confused. As I said in, I think, the beginning of this video here, that some rules text is a bit confusing about how it's worded and things like that. Or if I didn't say that, anyway, I'm going to say it here again. But some words and text is worded a bit weird, so you can misinterpret how a card works sometimes, and things like that. So again, oh, well, that's my bad for not understanding exactly how the card works, because it's an old card, it's worded a bit weird or whatever, or it's just a new card that is worded a bit weirdly, or whatnot. Or I forgot that, Beast Whisperer is a cast trigger or whatever, or this is a cast trigger or whatever. So I forgot, oh, yes, so, you still get that card, or you still get this or whatever out of it. And even when it's your own thing, you might go, oh, okay, well, that's the end of that. Cool. Well, I passed my turn, I guess. But you forget, oh, well, that was actually cast effect or whatever. So you can't really get rid of it. So that still resolves and still draw a card at least. So things like that, it is helpful for those people as well. Go, well, remember my own triggers, or remember how my own effects work, and go, well, is this a cast trigger, or is this what's this? How does this work? Does my thing have to resolve essentially for this effect to, come into play or whatnot? So again, knowing how your own cards work and whatnot, also helps you, because especially when somebody's playing a blue deck, it's like, well, they might have counter spells. Like, I tend to not, but a lot of people tend to when they're playing blue. So it's one of those things where you might be like, right, well, I've got to keep my eyes and ears open with that person and be like, if anyone's going to respond, for the most part, it's going to be that person playing blue over there. So I'm just going to be like, okay, does that resolve or whatever, sort of thing, But anyway, guys, as I said, hope it is useful to you in some regards, in some ways. You can let me know what you think about this. Write your thoughts down there in those comments below. I'll be sure to respond. I love to talk about all of this sort of stuff as well, even though it's a little bit complicated and sometimes it even goes over my head and I've got to think for a few minutes with some of it. I do love to talk about it, and I do love to hear what other people say and how we can, all get better at understanding the rules and playing the best form of Magic that we can all play, because, hey, we don't want to just be numpties that don't seem to know what we're doing here. We want to seem like we do know what we're doing, at least a little bit. So, yeah, there we go. But, hey, we don't have to be all super competitive about it, I don't think. And again, as I sort of said, you don't have to browbeat people to, like in a memeing way, I think it's fine. But, hey, being, too serious or too, stuck into the rules or whatever is not the way to go with most things, because, hey, people just want to play the game and have fun and enjoy themselves. So that's the way it's going to be for the most part. And most people, when they get back to their kitchen table, might be just like, oh, yeah, I forgot that again or whatever. Or my commander, when it ETBs, I always forget, it draws me a card or this or that or whatever. I always forget that because it's the most irrelevant part of the text of the card, or whatever it is. So, but yeah, that's the way it is. Anyway, guys, as I said, hope you have enjoyed. And yeah, if I don't see you down there in those comments, I'll see you in the next one.